Beneath the busiest port complex in North America, stretching more than 12 miles under southern Los Angeles and out into San Pedro Bay, sits a fault line that scientists spent decades assuming was dead. It wasn't on the public radar the way the San Andreas is. It doesn't show up in the earthquake conversations most Angelinos have ever had. And unlike the faults most people picture when they think about California earthquakes, this one doesn't even break the surface. It's what geologists call a blind fault, invisible from above, undetectable by simply looking at the ground, and for years considered geologically inactive. New research has now confirmed otherwise. The Wilmington Fault, running directly beneath the port of Los Angeles and the port of Long Beach, two facilities that together handle a staggering share of all cargo entering the United States, is very likely still active. Is very likely producing an earthquake of magnitude 6.3 or greater, directly beneath one of the most economically critical and densely populated stretches of coastline in the country. Today, we're breaking down exactly what the Wilmington Fault is, why it stayed hidden for so long, why it stayed hidden for so long. Thrust fault is uniquely dangerous compared to the faults Los Angeles has spent decades preparing for, and how this discovery fits into the broader picture of a Southern California. Recent research already describes under more stress than at any point in the last 1,000 years. Drop a comment right now. If you live anywhere near the ports of LA or Long Beach or anywhere in Southern California generally, tell me if this is the first time you've heard of the Wilmington Fault. And if you want the update the moment new research on this comes out, subscribe right now. It's free. A thumbs up helps enormously. Let's get this to 5,000 likes so it reaches the people who need to see it. Now let's get into it. What the Wilmington Fault actually is. The Wilmington Fault sits beneath the Los Angeles Basin, running roughly 12.4 miles from southern Los Angeles out under San Pedro Bay, passing directly beneath the combined footprint of the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. Together, these two ports form the busiest container port complex in the Western Hemisphere, handling an enormous share of the goods that move in and out of the United States by sea. Any hazard sitting directly underneath that infrastructure carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate region. What makes the Wilmington Fault different from the faults most people associate with California earthquakes is its structure. Faults like the San Andreas are strike-slip faults, meaning the ground on either side moves horizontally past itself. And critically, these faults typically break the Earth's surface, leaving a visible trace that geologists can map, study, and monitor directly. The Wilmington Fault is a blind thrust fault. Rather than the surface cracking open, one block of crust is pushed up and over the block beside it at depth, with the rupture staying entirely below the surface. That structural difference is exactly why the Wilmington Fault sat unrecognized as a genuine hazard for so long. There was no visible scar in the landscape pointing to it, no obvious surface feature for researchers to trace and investigate the way they can with a fault like the San Andreas. Why blind makes this genuinely more dangerous, not less. It would be reasonable to assume a fault you can't see is somehow less threatening than one you can. The opposite is closer to the truth. The opposite lesson Los Angeles has already learned once before. The magnitude 6.7. The magnitude earthquake that struck Los Angeles in 1994 killed more than 60 people, injured thousands, caused tens of billions of dollars in damage. That earthquake came from the rupture of a blind thrust fault. The same category of fault as Wilmington. The same category of fault. Northridge demonstrated in the most direct way possible that see on the surface was still fully capable of producing one of the most destructive earthquakes in the region's modern history. Blind faults are harder to study precisely because they don't offer geologists the surface clues that strike-slip faults do. Researchers have to rely on subsurface data, seismic reflection surveys, well log records, and painstaking reconstruction of the deep rock layers to even confirm a blind fault's existence in geometry, let alone determine whether it remains active after millions of years of apparent quiet. That's exactly the process researchers went through with Wilmington. The fault's presence had been known to geologists for some time. What has now been established through more recent research is that it is very likely still active today, not a dead structure left over from an ancient period of crustal movement, but a fault genuinely capable of producing a significant earthquake in the present. The specific threat this fault poses, recent analysis puts the Wilmington Fault's potential at a magnitude of 6.3 or greater. A threshold that, on its own, might not sound like the region's worst-case scenario compared to a major San Andreas rupture. But magnitude alone has never told the full story of an earthquake's danger, and the Wilmington Fault's specific characteristics make even a 6.3 class event a serious concern rather than a minor one. Blind thrust earthquakes tend to produce intense, concentrated shaking directly above the rupture, exactly the pattern seen during Northridge, because the energy release happens at relatively shallow depth beneath the affected area rather than being distributed along a long surface trace. And the location could hardly be more consequential. A significant earthquake directly beneath the Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach threatens critical infrastructure that the broader U.S. economy depends on daily, from container cranes and rail yards to fuel storage in the dense industrial corridor surrounding both ports. Geological researchers studying the fault have specifically noted that while public attention in California remains overwhelmingly focused on strike-slip faults like the San Andreas, the Los Angeles Basin's blind thrust faults represent what one researcher described as an equally hazardous but far less visible counterpart, hiding in the subsurface while the region's earthquake preparedness conversation continues to center on the faults people can actually see. Not the only blind fault, and not the only hazard growing beneath LA. Not the only hazard growing beneath LA. Here's where this discovery becomes part of a much larger and more urgent picture rather than standing alone. The Wilmington Fault's confirmed activity raises an uncomfortable follow-up question that the researchers themselves have pointed to directly. If one previously assumed dead blind fault beneath Los Angeles turns out to still be active, what about the others? The Los Angeles Basin sits within a genuinely complex tectonic environment, caught between converging sections of the North American and Pacific plates, a configuration one Harvard researcher who helped discover an earlier LA area blind fault back in the late 1990s described simply as leaving the city caught in a vice. Multiple blind thrust faults are known or suspected to underlie various parts of the greater Los Angeles area, and Wilmington's confirmed activity status is a reminder that the region's full seismic hazard map may still be incomplete even after decades of dedicated research. This discovery also lands at a specific moment for Southern California seismology. Earlier this year, researchers published findings showing that the southern San Andreas Fault and the adjacent San Jacinto Fault have reached their highest stress levels in the past 1,000 years, with a specific junction called Cajun Pass, roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, identified as an earthquake gate capable of allowing a rupture to jump between both fault systems and produce a joint event potentially reaching magnitude 7.4 to 7.8. That research explicitly does not predict and the study's lead author has been clear that the findings describe elevated risk conditions rather than an imminent forecast, rather than an establishes a broader context in which the Wilmington Fault discovery does not exist in isolation. It's one additional, previously underappreciated hazard layered on top of independent research already describes has been in a millennium. Stressed than it has been. What this means for how Los Angeles thinks about risk. For decades, earthquake preparedness messaging in Southern California has centered heavily on the San Andreas Fault specifically, the mental image of the big one that most residents carry. That focus makes sense, given the San Andreas' scale and its extensively documented history. But the Wilmington Fault discovery is a direct illustration of why concentrating public risk perception on a single, famous fault leaves genuine gaps in both public awareness and, more importantly, in the infrastructure planning that depends on accurate hazard maps. Blind thrust faults do not announce themselves the way a mapped surface trace does. They require deliberate, resource-intensive subsurface research to even locate, and confirming whether a given blind fault remains active takes additional years of specialized study beyond simply identifying that it exists. The practical consequence of a discovery like this is that seismic hazard assessments, building codes, and infrastructure resilience planning around the ports may need meaningful reassessment to account for a genuinely active fault running directly beneath facilities that were not necessarily engineered with this specific hazard in mind. That is not a fast or simple process. Retrofitting critical port infrastructure, updating regional hazard maps, and revising building requirements for the surrounding area all take years of coordinated effort, involving multiple government agencies, port authorities, and engineering teams. The research confirming Wilmington's activity is the necessary first step in a much longer process that Los Angeles and the broader Southern California region are only now beginning. What actually happens next? Scientists studying the Wilmington Fault will continue refining their understanding of its precise rupture history, how frequently it has produced significant earthquakes in the geological past, and what that history suggests about the interval between major events. That kind of paleoseismic work, digging into trenches, analyzing sediment layers, and dating past rupture evidence, is exactly how researchers established that the southern San Andreas system was reaching unprecedented stress levels, and similar detailed work will likely follow for Wilmington now that its active status has been confirmed. None of that research is likely to produce a specific prediction of when a Wilmington Fault earthquake might occur. Earthquake prediction, in the sense of a precise time and date, remains outside current scientific capability for any fault, blind or otherwise. What it will do is sharpen the hazard estimate for the region and inform the infrastructure decisions that now need to account for this fault as a confirmed active threat, rather than an assumed dormant curiosity. The Wilmington Fault sat beneath one of the busiest and most economically vital stretches of coastline in the United States for decades without drawing the kind of attention its confirmed activity now demands. That is precisely the danger blind faults pose, not that they're inherently more powerful than the faults everyone already knows about, but that they can sit unrecognized directly beneath critical infrastructure, until dedicated research finally reveals what's actually happening in the rock below. Los Angeles has learned this lesson before at Northridge, at enormous human and economic cost. The Wilmington Fault discovery is a reminder that the region's seismic hazard picture is still being actively completed, even after generations of study, and that the faults capable of causing serious damage are not limited to the ones with a name most people already recognize. We'll keep tracking this as more research comes out on Wilmington, and on the broader Southern California Fault network. So you don't miss the update the moment it happens. So you don't miss the update. Drop that comment. Had you heard of the Wilmington Fault before today? Had you heard of the Wilmington Fault? Let's get this to 5,000 likes. So it reaches to 5,000 likes. So it reaches you in the next one. Need to see it. See you in the next one.